Okay, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I too would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their elders past and present, and that has formed a very fundamental part of my personal campaign against coal seam gas. I'd also like to thank Paul, not just for his coming to speak today. I'm an ecologist, I'm a scientist, I'm not an economist. I talk to a lot of people about a lot of the different issues about coal seam gas. And I shamelessly plagiarise all of Paul's work from his first book and use all of his references and completely rely on his research. So thank you, Paul. I haven't read his second book, but his first book is definitely worth a read. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about coal seam gas, which is one of the new kids on the block in the mining boom, and how it affects us, and how it affects us in ways that the government and the industries aren't even thinking about. And coal seam gas is really, really important because unlike the video at the start, this is not happening hundreds of miles away in barely inhabited land. This is happening in our farming land, this is happening in our water catchments, this is happening in our prime agricultural regions whose soil is actually the envy of the world, and it's also happening in our suburbs. So it is not something that's happening over there and away from everywhere, it's actually happening across, particularly across New South Wales and Queensland, everywhere. So what I'll start off with is just quickly talk to you about coal seam gas and how they get it out. So this is a diagram that is fairly simplistic, but this is actually better than most of the diagrams that come out of the industry. Coal seam gas, the government would have you believe that it is natural gas. The government and the industry are quite happy to call it natural gas and to have everyone believe that it is. What most people think of natural gas is they think of conventionally drilled natural gas. So coal seam gas is one of the unconventionally drilled gas sources that's only really been around in any large quantity in the last couple of years. In Australia we call it coal seam gas. In America they call it coal bed methane. It is the same gas, it is methane. All of these different unconventional gases are the same gas, it is all methane, but they come out of different sources under the ground, and it's the method of extraction that causes all the problems. So as we can see here, we've got a typical, we've basically got a description. Over on the right hand side you've got conventionally associated gas. If you think of more like a big balloon, you can access a huge amount of gas from 2 or 3 wells. When you move into the unconventional gases, the shale gas, the tight sand gas, the coal bed methane or the coal seam gas, basically it's coming out of a rock layer. So rather than having a large amount of gas, if you put a couple of holes in it, it all comes out. The gas is actually stuck in there and it needs vigorous force to extract it, which also means you can only extract gas from a small area around each individual gas well. Interestingly, on this diagram, which is produced by the US Geological Survey, it's got a seal in between the tight sands gas and the overlying strata. If you talk to the Australian coal seam gas miners, they say that seal is above the coal bed methane. More recently, and this is what they're saying, it's safe. It's safe because the seal, you can't break the seal. They forget that they're actually drilling through that seal and they're removing pressure from underneath it, which causes all sorts of problems. But increasingly, all the evidence is pointing to the fact that there is no such imaginary plastic lining that separates our resources from the rest of the world. That in fact, they're causing a hell of a lot more problems that may actually just take a lot longer to discover. So what do? This is a horizontal well. So they drill down and they drill along and they pop up little wellheads at the other end. So you can think of a coal seam gas well. It's almost like a bicycle. You've got the hub of the bicycle wheel in the middle, you've got spokes going out, and then you've got the wellheads at other locations. So this is the method that they're saying they're going to do in Australia. At the moment they just do vertical wells, which means they just go straight down. The difference between a vertical well and a horizontal well, vertical wells, over on the left-hand side or the right-hand side, you need one every 400 metres to 700 metres. When you've got the horizontal wells like this, those wellhead spaces can be up to 10 kilometres apart. So you need many less wells in the horizontal drilling. However, they're not actually doing that in Australia, they just keep talking it up that that's going to solve half the problems. Now if you've seen the ad by the coal seam gas companies and they show you a tiny little area of the coal seam gas well and say, look, this is tiny, what they're actually showing you is one of these collection wellheads at the other end. They don't show you all the infrastructure, they don't show you the connections, they don't show you all the infrastructure around the main pond. And that's where we have a lot of the problems. So I've got some images here. Because, and the images are quite confronting, and the reason I use images is because it's really hard to explain to people otherwise. Now this is in the Pilliga State Forest. So this is our state forest that's meant to be for us. And you can see coal seam gas, a portion of a coal seam gas field. So they have 87 gas wells in the Pilliga. They are running a gas-fired power station off those 87 wells. And as you can see, each wellhead, there's about 8 on that photo, or 9 or 10 on that photo, are connected by roads and pipelines. Now I have a sign at the top of this picture saying production versus exploration. A lot of the issues that have come up, a lot of the things in the media that you've heard talk about exploration licences, the environmental standards, the regulations, everything that a company needs to go through for an exploration licence are completely different from a production licence. So the bars that they have to jump through for production are a hell of a lot more stringent and rigorous if they were properly regulated than an exploration licence. This is an exploration licence. There is no physical difference in the activity between an exploration licence and a production licence. The only difference between turning this into a production field is them having to jump through all the hoops and getting it signed off. They're not exploring to see if the coal seam gas is there, they're exploring to see how economic it is to extract that resource from that area given a number of set of methods. So it's very important to note when they're talking about exploration, this fully functioning production gas field can be exploration. Now, as you can see, these are quite closely spaced together because you only extract the gas from underneath each gas field, each gas wellhead. Once that gas is exhausted, it will replenish over time, but not in enough time for the companies to strip the profit out of it. So I like to call it the mushroom effect. They need to keep expanding the field on the edges to keep accessing new gas sources because they don't have the time to wait for these particular gas fields to refill. So I call it the mushroom effect, and this is what happens. This is over in Sonora in Texas. This is just an image from Google Earth. So every little polka dot is a coal seam gas well. If you actually hop onto Google Earth, you can move page after page after page, and it looks exactly like this. And when they say, but it's different in Australia, here's a picture of chinchilla in Queensland. It looks exactly the same. They've already got 6,000 wells in Queensland, they're pushing to have 40,000 wells. A completed coal seam gas field will look no different than what is happening in America. So what I'm going to talk about today, very briefly, is the ecological impacts of this drilling method. So I'm not going to go into what if goes wrong or all the other issues, I'm just going to look at the environmental impacts on our ecology. So this fragmentation of the environment has some massive ecological impacts. Firstly, those roads create predation corridors and invasive species corridors. If you have trucks and people going into the middle of the Pilliga State Forest with weed seeds, you'll get weed seeds in the middle of the Pilliga State Forest where you weren't before. If you have wide roads that are easy for foxes and cats to run across, you will have more foxes and cats predating on the species inside. You've also got problems with edge effects, which I'll talk about in a minute, patch size, species movement, road barriers, and niche overlapping. And I'll talk about all of those using a particular couple of slides. So this is my imaginary forest. This is my imaginary Pilliga State Forest. And I'll start off with edge effects. We have a lot of unique flora and fauna in Australia. To a lot of us, the bush looks the same. To a lot of plant species and animal species, the bush looks incredibly different. So if you're on the outside of the forest, say in the blue zone, as you walk into the bush, the further in, your assemblages of flora and fauna change. They're different. So the species you find in the middle are very different than the species that you find on the edge. And that's why it's called edge effects, because that community on the edge is specialised to live in that environment where they've got some bush cover but they've also got some open cover. Many of the endangered species are the species that won't live too close to the edge, and each species will have a different range. Some of them will like to be 20 metres away, some of them might be 200 metres away. What actually happens when you do this, when you fragment the habitat like you have in the coal seam gas fields, you don't just shrink it, you're not just taking a piece out of the puzzle. Because of the edge effect, by putting in roads, you are reducing the habitat for those species way out of proportion to the size of the land that you've actually taken up. So those species that like to be 200 metres from open space no longer have anywhere to live. They cannot physically survive in that environment. You also have problems with road barriers and open spaces. Similarly to not liking to live close to the edge of a bush, different different animals have different open spaces that they're okay to cross. So some animals may be quite happy to cross a 2-metre road. Some of them might only be happy to cross a 1-metre road. So this is where national parks are always very careful, and they'll quite often have raised paths that will go up and over because they know the animals will run underneath, but they won't cross over the open space. And again, that is completely different for every singular species. So if you have a bunch of species in this area that won't cross an open road, and these roads are 50 metres wide, at least, they have to be because they're also running gas pipes and the fire danger is so high. These species will not cross. So basically what you end up having is you end up having an isolated population of this particular species. It inbreeds, it can't cross, it loses the chance to gain new genes, it becomes less robust, and it will eventually die out. So you can actually start having localised extinctions of species in between every single one of these patches. Alternatively, what you've also now got roads. So these species are no longer just under threat by the lack of genetic diversity and the fact that they can't cross roads to breed. The foxes and the wolves are a hell of a lot closer together. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'll quickly speed up. Similar things are happening underground. We don't know anything in Eastern Australia about our underground ecosystems, and we have no idea whether the same processes apply in those systems. So we have our styrofoam communities. In Western Australia and everywhere else in the world, these are considered critically important. There's 2 people in New South Wales that study styrofoam communities. These are really important for our future. These are the bacteria that will help us kill off after oil pollution. These are the bacteria that thrive on harsh environments. These are the animals that can actually produce methane from carbon dioxide that could actually give us a renewable resource into the future, not if we kill them off first. Further downstream, looking slightly larger, coal seam gas uses a huge amount of water, and the government is letting them get away with everything. So Queensland actually issued permits, and this is one example of water into the Condamine. So if you're worried about the Condamines, nowhere near me. The Condamine is the head of the Murray-Darling Basin, which basically feeds the Great Artesian Basin, which waters our food bowl. Drinking water for 3 million people. Basically waters our food area, home to 30,000 wetlands. The Queensland Government authorised approval of dumping of a whole lot of toxic water. These are just some of the things. So they're allowed to put dichloroethane from the coal seam gas well at 2,000% of the guidelines. The list is actually massive, and I've removed it from this presentation. But they actually had 19 contaminants that were approved to be released 100-fold over their limits. Another 42 of the contaminants that they were given approval for were actually given approval at their limits. Now, the federal government actually says you can't go to the limit. You're not meant to use the limit as an absolute minimum. That's meant to be like, worst case scenario. It's meant to be where you start to get really alarmed. Can we treat this water? So is this water a problem if we can treat it? We can't treat it, basically. One of the biggest problems with this water is it's salty. The industry conservatively would need to treat 300 gigalitres of water a year. That's conservatively, and I would think that that's actually about 1/10 of what it actually is. The Sydney desalination plant processes 40 gigalitres of water a year. So we would need so many more desalination plants just to treat the water, which starts making the fact that it's a clean green energy look a little bit silly. There's also, and I'll skip through most of it, you can read it if you're interested. In Australia, we're a dry continent. Permanent water in itself, even if it was the best quality drinking water, can be toxic. We have ephemeral creek systems, we have flora and fauna that have evolved to have wet and dry periods. This is what Australia is. They cannot actually cope with permanent water supply. So even if there is nothing wrong with the water, simply having permanent water courses will actually change the shape of the ecology in Australia. Further downstream, eventually this is all running into the reef. So any of the toxins that they pump in upstream can actually possibly end up down on the reef. So Lock the Gate Alliance has now started up a new group called Save the Reef that is focusing on the toxins in the water that's coming down from the coal seam gas plants, but also from the infrastructure that has been built on the Great Barrier Reef to export this to China. There's also a really big problem with the lack of science. We don't even know if there will be environmental harm. The companies are not committing to any sort of pre-drilling testing. They're not doing any baseline studies. And we've got a classic case here that's recently come up, was recently published. This is not to do with coal seam gas, but this is to do with a chemical spill that happened in one of the local Sydney rivers in 2005. In 2008, it went to the EPA and the company got fined. In 2011, we've actually found out that they've actually genetically altered an entire species in that area, but it wasn't until about 3 years after the court case actually happened. So in many cases, we will have no idea of the damage that has already been done. On a bigger scale, this is a paper, and I'm quite happy for my presentation to be handed around. This is by Wigley. He's one of Australia's leading climate change scientists. He's actually modelled if we swap from coal to gas, because gas has been promoted as a transitional fuel, we will actually have an acceleration of climate change for the next 30 years because it's methane, not carbon dioxide. It is not a solution for climate change. It is a non-renewable resource. It is methane, which is at least 21, if not 70 times more toxic for climate change than carbon dioxide. But it's not all bad news. We've put lots of straw on this industry. We've had lots of pieces of straw. We've had lots of wins. We now have federal legislation. We had an 18-month halt in New South Wales. And yesterday we had thousands of people across New South Wales spelling out one simple message. Thank you.